Hi, everybody. You've been listening to us while my guests and today's guests and I talk and get ourselves comfortable. Today's Martin Luther King Day, special holiday. And today's webinar is about him and the impact of civil rights on disability rights and a little more than that. So really excited about it. And I'll introduce Gabe and Gyasi in a little while. I'm going to do our COVID thing, but I'm probably going to go through it faster than usual. And can always talk about it later as well if people want. But today's hopefully, I'm sure those of you coming on are interested in the main topic today. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. And I'm glad you're able to be with us today. So let me start the slideshow from the start. And I already shared with you what today's about, Martin Luther King Jr., and then the impact of civil rights on civil rights movement on the disability rights. And I'll keep my eye open on the participants thing too. In fact, hopefully that'll pop up on my screen. So it's been a tough week. Not as bad as the week before, but still pretty tough. Virus numbers in Massachusetts increased by 30,000. So there's been 444,000 people that did have the virus, that have had the virus. So that's pretty powerful stuff. I also want to say I'm reporting one less day than usual. So just to make you aware of that, because of just the timing of the reports now, it's changing. In terms of the USA, in terms of deaths, 430 more deaths in those last days. It was over 600 the last time I shared it with you. So it's been a tough week that way as well. 13,305 people have died since March in Massachusetts. And in the USA, 23.4 million people have experienced the virus. And there's been almost literally, scores away, tens away from 391,000 deaths. The highest per capita looks like is Dakota's, Utah, and Tennessee. The highest numbers, of course, are in the bigger states. Well, not all the bigger states. Florida, I wouldn't necessarily say is one of the big populated states, but California, Texas, Florida, and New York rank the highest in terms of the numbers of deaths. So it's really continues to be a very significant health hazard. And all of us, of course, pray that we'll get through this period with the vaccine and that the new strain will respond to the vaccine as well. Just some statistics, we've got 280 positive cases, and we've gone up hundreds in terms of clients recovered. It's nearly 1,900 in the community system. It's 214 in the state operated system. There's 25 positive cases. And then I just want to take you to this time, for the first time I'm showing you, I report verbally sometimes on this. These are the facilities. And I thought I'd show you how that chart looks since I haven't been, instead of curves and graphs that I've been sharing. And you can see Hogan Regional Center has 8 people out of 106 right now. And then you can see the Soldiers Home, you can see Lemuel Shattuck, you can see other places. Then at the very bottom is Rentham Development Center with 11 active cases out of 211. So, we continue to experience the vaccine in some pretty serious ways. And, basically these are the phases, and a lot of us will be in phase 2. I think a lot of people, caregivers, could be early in phase 2. And now they've moved it to adults 65 plus. And we've been advocating for more than that. Our key advocacy issues continue to reflect these issues. And of course, the vaccine has a lot of our attention. And in addition to our advocacy, we've been partnering with law centers and with other statewide groups, advocacy groups, and health groups to move further ahead in terms of the vaccine for not only our population, but our families and staff in the field. Congregate care providers began residentially last week. Home health began this week, and actually this week's the big week for the state level congregate care, though some folks in the federal plan started last week in the vaccine. And home health applies to also in-home family support services and a whole range of things, but not to unpaid caregivers yet. So family caregivers we're still, hoping will get moved up in that pecking order. And we can talk again about that at the end, but the reality is there's not enough administrators for the vaccine as well as enough vaccine. And that's what we need to see happen in Massachusetts and across the country. So, and in a couple of days, there'll be an order for that, more vaccines coming out. So today's Martin Luther King Jr., his day, holiday in honor of him. I'm really pleased to have Gabe Vonleh and Gyasi Burks-Abbott with me today. Gabriel's the CEO of Opportunities for Inclusion, an affiliate of the ARC, and a good colleague of mine. And he has led in the past Public Health Center in New York right before he came back to Massachusetts. I got a feeling the families pulled you back to Massachusetts from New York State. We talked quite a bit alone, but I never pinned him down specifically on coming back here. But he also was in a leadership position in Mass Health in the past, and I think was COO at the time. So he's got a strong background. So pleased to have him with us. And Jassy, been to DC together, is former Len Fellow. He's a board member of Advocacy for Autism Massachusetts, and he's very active in government affairs as well, just in the community, and a great observer. So I asked them if they would please help us really focus on a dialogue, first about Martin Luther King, and secondly, about the impact of civil rights on the disability movement. And then thirdly, about how much civil rights we're seeing in our own disability movement. So it's a lot to cover in a small amount of time, but I think we're pretty gung-ho about it. And so without further ado, I'm not going to read this thing. Everyone will get the wonderful story about Martin. It's a snapshot, but I'm going to ask, I think, Gabe to start. And just the quote up there is, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." So let me put you on spotlight and get you to start, and we'll get going.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Certainly today marks the day where we celebrate a very special individual in our nation, especially as we look around today. Someone like Martin Luther King Jr., the legacy that he's left becomes very current in what's happening today. When you look at the man, Martin Luther King, as an individual, he left an indelible mark on our society as far as looking at equity across the board. One of the things that we all remember is his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, a 17-minute speech that took place in Washington, D.C., where he really started to lay some of the blueprint of saying that we are one nation and we need to look at our nation and really question ourselves as far as how we want to move forward, that we need to coexist. We need to coexist peacefully. We need to coexist as one nation, providing equity along the lines and not creating segregation based on our racial backgrounds. So as we reflect on him, it's important to also know that a lot of people believe that, okay, Martin was fighting for people of color. Yes, that's true. But what a lot of people don't understand is that he had phases in the struggle for civil rights. At one point they were focused on desegregating, integrating people was one element, but there was an economic component that I feel like he really didn't get a chance to complete before his assassination. But when you look at Martin, he talked about equity across so many different lines, social, economic lines. And he tried to not just base it on focus on the color of one's skin, but really looking at how do we engage society as a whole and look at each other in an equitable manner. He talked about, and he was influenced, he was very universal in his thought. As some of you know, he opposed the war, the Vietnam War. He was not a proponent of that war that took place. basically still talking about the rights of people, not just in the United States, but globally. And those experiences has a lot to do with his exposure to, you know, the Gandhi principle of nonviolence. How do we engage each other in a nonviolent way? As you can see today, that concept still remains something that we need to practice. So when you look at our industry, the intellectual and developmental disabilities industry, there's still a component there that really correlates to what we do, our advocacy and all the stuff we do. Some of those things that we do has a foundation that comes from that civil rights movement. So
before, I'm going to ask you to hold on that for a second before we do that. You're about to segue into a really important topic. Before
yes.
you do that, something you woke me up to, and I'm going to add a spotlight for Gyasi too, I think is when you mentioned Gandhi, yes, a few days ago when the three of us talked.
Mm-hmm.
Here Martin was Christian,
Yes.
but yet he took nonviolence from someone of a different faith.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Your point about it was international and universal, it really woke me up.
Yes.
About that. And he gave a model of that. And then I just want to emphasize the Poor People's Campaign that you pointed out, the economic thing, which people will see later, the PowerPoint. But that was maybe that quote of his, if we are silent about things that matter, that's when we begin to die. And that might be like an onion peeling for him when he decided to speak about that. Let's give Gyasi a minute to mention anything he wants from Martin Luther King from a much different. So both Gabe and Gyasi are younger than me. So I was telling both of them, I was telling Gabe, who's closer to my age, that I actually grew up seeing Martin Luther King on TV and having kids come from part of New York to my school at fourth grade, a busing program. It wasn't two-way, it was one-way, which probably isn't fair, but it allowed me to connect with others in a way that I wouldn't have had the opportunity. Again, that was an impact personally in my life. But Gyasi, you want to comment? And before Gabe segues us to the disability rights.
Yeah, sure. I would like to actually, thinking about the whole international piece, when I was about to say Gandhi, when King went to India, he was actually introduced as one of America's untouchables. And he definitely saw a kinship between the untouchables of India and the untouchables of America. In other words, oppressed people. He saw the relationship. But when I think about King, I think about some of the things that we can learn from him, how he could inspire us today. For instance, he actually, John Lewis talks about how he himself was inspired to get into the movement when he heard Martin Luther King preaching the social gospel, as in taking the teachings of the Bible and applying them to everyday life. And I think that's something we can actually borrow, because even if, let's say, our inspirations are more secular, they might be, for instance, our knowledge of the law, our knowledge of science, our knowledge of public policy, but just ways of actually applying this to actual lived experience of people. And another thing that also strikes me about King is his eternal optimism. He always had faith that things were going to work out. I mean, regardless of how hopeless things looked or how the chips were down, he always either felt things were going to work out or he always figured out another way. Wow. And I think another aspect is his philosophy of nonviolence. Because it's not simply just not being violent, it's actually taking direct action and changing the conversation. I mean, in essence, it's basically saying, I'm not going to be complicit in my oppression, but I'm not going to respond with anger. I'm not going to react. I'm not going to be reactive. I'm going to be reflective. I'm going to strategize. I'm going to think of a constructive way of handling it. I mean, one thing like about the Montgomery bus boycott is people usually think of it as he was trying to bankrupt the bus company. He actually wasn't. If that happened, fine. What he was more interested in is saying, I am not going to be complicit in my own oppression, and I'm going to pull myself back, and hopefully this will awaken the conscience of the citizens of Montgomery. So basically, he was making a positive statement, but he also wasn't just reacting out of anger. That was part of the nonviolence. It was being disciplined. It was being actually My grandfather was also from the South. He was from Alabama. Actually, reminds me very much of John Lewis. My grandfather always had the 3 C's: be calm, cool, and collected.
Wow.
Mm.
He probably learned that
Might have, yeah.
growing up in an area that was tough to be growing up in, right? In terms of how he would have to handle. There's a scene in A Night in Miami where Jim Brown is this white gentleman is being, oh, I'll do anything for you and whatever. So he says, oh, okay. And the daughter suddenly reminds the father they've got to move a piece of furniture, the grandfather, and said, oh, and Jim Brown goes, oh, I'll be happy to give you a hand. And he goes, oh, you know, and I'm not going to use the word he used. Oh, you know, we don't allow any Negroes in the house. And of course, Jim Brown's standing there befuddled, right? He's like, just got this wonderful, I'll do anything for you, but you know, and that's like your grandfather would have probably learned, you know, from experiences, right? And that's to think that people could not ride on the bus together, and that's not that long ago. I mean, I was a child when some of that was still going on, and I know I'm old, but I'm not that old.
No, Leo, you're not that old. Yeah. You gotta stop saying that. But I think that's the key thing. Like Gyasi mentioned, you know, I had the opportunity to be 8 years ago. I visited India and I experienced the caste system, where the gentleman that was driving us around, when we went to a restaurant, I offered him to come in and eat with us. And I didn't understand why he was not allowed to come and sit with us. And then later on, my friend who lived there said, well, you need to understand that there is a system here where they're not allowed to associate with certain people, you know. And I was like, wow.
So that was recently as 8 years ago.
Yeah, that still exists. That still exists in India. The caste system still exists. So, you know, as we talk about these things, you know, I was probably around 3 years old when Martin Luther King got assassinated. But what he spoke of was so long ago, and it's still relevant today.
Yeah.
In all the different struggles, and that has really permeated into other industries. And I think it's just so powerful to see that so many years ago we've had some improvement, but things have not really changed as much as we think.
Yeah.
Some of those things is very subtle in today's world, but it still exists. And when he speaks of the brotherhood, he was trying to remove the struggle from just being African-American centric struggle to say, listen, it's a human struggle. And I think that's where we need to go. And it's an economic struggle. It's equity. It's treating people with that level of equity, whether it's in the disability world, where people are trying to be recognized that, hey, I'm a part of society.
Yes.
And I can produce, I can contribute, and give me that opportunity. So that theme goes into a lot of different industry, and it's very powerful to see.
Keep talking about it while I show this. I'm going to show the slide that goes from Martin to what we learned, the 1976 article in New York Times.
Yes.
Special education is now a matter of civil rights. Mm-hmm. And then some of the commonalities, but that as you say, still exist today. It hasn't gone away. Some of the principle of justice, principled positions, grassroots advocacy, and Brown versus Board of Education was adapted to special education cases. I don't know how many people know that, but that was literally, a conversation Governor Dubois had with the attorneys in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania case and the Maryland case. And let me get out of there again so we can go back to you all talking. Let me just stop that again and feature on you.
But Leo, I think when you think about our industry, also the level of advocacy that you and some of the executives within the art program spearheads, is that whole grassroots is bringing families together, is bringing people together to say, you know what, we believe in this cause and we're going to stand together. And I think some of those grassroots activity reminds me of that civil rights movement, where people came together from different communities with a common cause, and it had to do with humanity and the dignity of a human being. And that's how we do on a daily basis in our business.
Do you think how do you, sort of, around the COVID, I think there's been a shared advocacy, right, around healthcare priorities amongst diversity, economics, disability, right? There's been this whole age, by the way, too, right? People who are older. There's been a coming together of groups to say, hey, let's have a crisis standards of care that are fair, right, equitable for all groups. I've seen that the most. It hasn't been the same in the police reform law because it was such a conflictual law. We didn't publicly take a position, right, on the whole thing. Maybe we should have. I mean, obviously, we wanted to see progress and some certification. We ended up pushing. There was a commonality, though, because there's education for working with people with disabilities now. That one of the bills that came out of the Autism Commission, that's cross intellectual developmental disabilities, that's now in the police reform law. That's an example of maybe perhaps separately moving ahead, but there is, the COVID was us moving ahead together. Do you think there are themes with that? I know we didn't talk about that in our prep, but I'm thinking given where you're at, Gabe and Gyasi, you guys can think through one.
I guess a common, of course, with COVID, there are a lot of commonalities. I mean, the fact that, for instance, people of color are disproportionately affected by COVID as people with disabilities are. But even going beyond COVID, or let's say pre-COVID, one of the reasons people with disabilities are disproportionately affected is because they're in congregate settings. And basically that relates to the issue of, well, in the context of Black rights, we call that segregation. But of course, in the context of disability rights, we call that institutionalization. So in essence, the goal of inclusion is basically shared by both constituencies. The idea of being part of mainstream society and it actually not being, there is no separate but equal. In other words, you cannot be a full human being and a full citizen if, whether because of your disability or your race, you're forced to live separate from your cohorts.
Great point.
That's a very good point, Jassy. And I think to that point, even if we look at COVID and those that are impacted, once again, we still see that disparity, right? As you look at one social economic background, they're impacted. When you look at a minority community, you can see that they're always impacted adversely. And then when that solution comes, and the sad thing that's happening now because of the history of our country, you still have African Americans that are uncomfortable with a vaccine simply because historically, when you look at the Tuskegee experiment and all those things, people have built this distrust for government that, oh, if there's a vaccine, is this a vaccine to terminate me? Or is it a vaccine that's actually going to help me? Yeah. So all of these things makes it very important that we need to re-educate people and come to that place of brotherhood and trust.
Let me ask you too about this theme. Lou Nissenbaum, who was a strong advocate who died way too young, he was active with mass families, and also we had a policy work we all did together. He would talk about theism and usism. Now, theism we know about, which is Jassy was sort of talking about that, right? Separate but equal kind of theme that's no good. But he talked about usism, when we take on what society has done to us. I think, Gabe, you sort of touched on that, whether it's a minority issue or whether it's a disability issue. And we were talking about in terms of disability.
You mean like internalized ableism, maybe?
Yeah, right. And how do we help people? Like, that's part of our work with the grassroots and education, right? Is helping people break out of that. Not just Tuskegee, but beyond Tuskegee, right? Yes. What people experienced every day of their lives, right? What they, in terms of the civil rights that they did not have, I was just listening to a podcast about Grant and how he personally wanted to see a different, even American Indians, Native Americans treated differently, but he couldn't get it implemented on the ground. And we know what happened with Reconstruction, where there was Black leadership after Civil War. And then there's decades. Do you think usism, how prevalent is that? Is that as prevalent sometimes as it is in the disability community, where people give up and feel like, we know in terms of our activism, probably 20% of the people are active, is that pretty consistent, do you think, too, in civil rights too?
Well, in civil rights, I guess there was always a schism, at least. Like, you had Du Bois and you had Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was more considered the accommodationist, where he said, I think he had the quote where, we can be together in all things important, but be as separate as the fingers on the hand in all things social. wherein, Du Bois was more for integration and the talented 10th. And I mean, so I mean, you of course you have, even even you had the disagreement sort of between Malcolm X and
Oh yes.
Martin Luther King.
Yes, that was a big yes.
Violence,
Yeah.
self-defense
Yeah.
versus integration versus separation.
Mhm.
So
And I think
definite parallels in the disability.
yes. And Jassy, that's a very good point that you make, because when you even look at, there was this big gap between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. But Malcolm X started to realize, and I think he came closer to Martin Luther King when he went to Mecca and saw that there were white people who didn't look like him.
Yeah, right.
From a religious perspective. He came back to America saying, you know what, I need to change my mentality and say it's not all about white people being evil, because there are white people who actually believe in this struggle and believe in this brotherhood. And I think had he lived, had he not been assassinated, I think that's where he was going, to say more towards Martin. It would have been very interesting had those two gentlemen lived,
Right.
to have their concept and philosophy fully blossom. I think they would have come together and realized the universality of humanity. And there are people where we come together. It's not about making someone feel guilty because of the pigmentation of their skin, but the content of the character, as Martin talked about.
Yeah.
How do we focus on that for the betterment of society? And I think that's where they were headed.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's definitely a schism in the disability community, even within the same disability, where you have debates about, what's high functioning, what's low functioning, who has a right to speak, who's a self advocate, who's not, and
Yes.
and you have,
Yes. One of the things I'm glad what you both have done with this line of thought, because you're taking it away from extremes of usism or non-us. You know what I mean? The internalizing. It's not really about that.
Right.
It really is about how we're shaped by what we're learning each day, what we hear, what our understanding is, and there are different shades, right, of understanding. And then if we find like-minded people of values, and it's about character, as you just said, Gabe, we can work together and make change happen. We don't give up in the face of adversity. That's good stuff.
That's very
One of the
good.
things in our own world, what do you think? So one of the I'm going to show one more of the screen. Let me show the last page, which has a quote from another, happens to be an African-American leader. What a coincidence. Famous author. We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. And again, that could apply equally, to race, and it can apply equally to disability, and it can apply equally to, I guess, sexual preference, sexual gender issues, you name it, economic, when people look down on people that are struggling to make a living. And then about in our disability work, do we have some civil rights schisms here? Are we doing enough? Are we aware enough? I don't think we have enough data, number one, about our constituents and how what kind of equity there is in sports. I know for parents as a whole, there's a feeling of not enough families first kind of support. And I would think that would weigh even more heavily if you're economically or in a minority situation, community. And then there's our workforce that is highly reflective, as you've pointed out, of diversity, Gabe. So do you guys want to comment on that? I'm going to get out of the share again so we can focus on our guests.
One thing that just struck me about that quote from Baldwin is it suggests that the discussion is more than just academic. It's actually about lived experience. In other words, you can't just have reasoning without some kind of reason about what, because reasoning can become rationalization. In other words, there has to be some kind of moral compass. In other words, you can reason, but how does this reasoning impact lived experience? It's interesting. The letter from Birmingham.
You say make it relevant. You have to have it relevant to something, or you've got no bearing, no grounding. Go ahead.
Logical. Because it's interesting. Like the letter from Birmingham jail actually is very much a document about moral reasoning. He's actually writing. King is writing in response to some ministers and rabbis who are taking him to task for being too extreme. and being untimely. And he's basically breaking down, you know, why
Yes.
he has to do what he's doing, and he's giving giving very reasoned arguments about when unjust law is, when a just law is, when it's okay to disobey a law. But basically, you have to apply it to lived experience. It can't just be these are academic arguments. It's like, okay, we can have these arguments. That seems to me Baldwin was saying, but
Mhm.
not if the conclusion of the argument is you get to oppress me. You know,
Yes. Yes.
that's a non-starter.
Right. Or
No,
you, yeah, go ahead, Gabe.
and I think that's a good point that is made. You know, and I always bring it back to what we're doing with our disability community. When you look at a society becomes powerful when the focus, especially in time of crisis, you know, when the focus is to look at those that are at the so-called bottom of society, to work from the bottom up. But we have the tendency to take care of people that are wealthy,
Yeah.
people that have a voice. They seem to get the benefits. When we talk about a lack of parity, even when we look at the vaccine, you know, we're advocating to say, hey, there are pockets, and I think Don Oaks kind of mentioned, there are pockets of people that we are not giving the attention they need. So we need to be that light that shines to say, you know, we need to focus on those that on the voiceless, or those that are in a corner struggling by themselves. We are obligated to bring the light on that, on families that are not getting to that line to get taken care of. So all of that, I look at it, all of that from a universal perspective, that we are powerful when we take care of the least among us, rather than because I have money, I can cut the line and I can get what I need and forget about everyone else. But I think that's what we need to continue to advocate for and put the light on.
So Gabe, you just referenced Dawn's entry about, you know, feeling left behind, and as many families were during phase one of the surge, where at first we were able to get more resources to them and then advocate for them. The state got the resources to them, thank God, through organizations and people working, the people, which we still owe a lot to the people that worked throughout this crisis. But also families were working 24/7 throughout this crisis.
Absolutely.
And we didn't get enough, especially once the summer kicked in, whatever, the double bind, not wanting a stranger in the house because they might get the virus. But then the flip side, can we get some other kind of resources at least, and not quite getting there in that advocacy? The other thing that I thought I just want to touch on with the chat was Linda mentioning not only reflecting on Gyasi's grandfather's quote, but also that stories of families enlighten us all. And as Beth mentioned, this isn't theoretical, it's about people's lives. It's sort of what Linda was saying in the beginning. You know, story of families is what moves us and enlightens us all as well. So there's some good chatter going on. If people haven't seen the chat there, amplifying the conversation. One of the things we're about to set up a new strategic plan for the next 3 years, and 3 years is the most we go out, and it isn't quite done. And I think perhaps this whole thing of COVID, what we learned about families and individuals with disabilities living on their own, and the impact there and the lack of resources, that might be something we put more juice in for the next 3 years. Families first, individuals first. We've talked about that before in our advocacy. And so I think that may be something, we haven't sketched it out yet, but hopefully we will have sketched out before March. Despite there being COVID, we're actually thinking about the next 3 years. So it's something, and I think civil rights is part of that within our community as well. Are we getting to everybody? And how do we know if we are or not? How do we, you know, any ideas on that? Do we want to talk about that a little bit, about how we make sure within our own disability movement, you know, we're being serious about cutting across the lines, you know, and being together, growing together.
Well, you know, one thing you've mentioned, Leo, on previous calls is you've looked at how to look at services differently based on what we've learned from COVID, and you've mentioned like thinking about investigating more, like for instance, the self-directed service models.
Yes.
And so some of the things already exist, and so I guess I mean that because that actually can help more because that's more individually based. It's not like people can kind of choose their own services and figure out what works for them. as opposed to just being one system that everyone has to try to fit.
The cookie cutter instead
Right.
of a
Very,
cookie.
very interested in what you're talking about, because you've been saying that for a few weeks now, a month actually.
Yeah, no, and turning up the juice on that. We have it there. How do we, and then using technology too as part of that, and whatever else makes sense. So Kathy just voiced in, well, maybe people are missing from the table. They're not invited. Maybe we look around the table. So in case of the ARC, who's missing from the table as well? And and I think that's the first step. I think it's deeper than that, because I think you can have the right people at the table, which gets you started. Which, if you don't have the right information, there's a problem too, right? There becomes because I get worried about momentum overrunning. This isn't sports. This is about good planning and making things that make sense. And I do feel like sometimes, even in our best moments, we made mistakes, because even a lawsuit, if you win and have a consent decree, it's not clean. You don't have a lot of flexibility in that, versus what Gyasi just mentioned about self-direction and trying to figure out ways people can get individualized supports. So we're getting some, helpful look at racial disparities at each point in life course. Yes. Yeah. So that's a good point too. Schools, it may be different than adult services and in medical care. Money should follow the person. And it looks like someone's saying here, Anna and Diane. Hi, Anna, by the way. In our CAB Consumer Advisory Board, we've tried very hard to diversify and have representation also from immigrant communities, because otherwise it's difficult to figure out how to engage folks who aren't at the table.
I think that's really important about the table, because I realize even I myself, I've recognized some of my own blind spots actually in the last 6 months or so. Things that I never actually thought about or considered. Because they're just not really part of my experience. But when someone points them out to me, or if I think about it, I'm like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. Because of course I'm in my own reality, but I don't see everything. And so I think having a lot of voices at the table is very important, because even people with goodwill may not be able to see everything.
Right.
Look, Jassy, I think that's a good point. And I think Kathleen Ryan mentioned, as we set the table for this discussion, we should always look around and see who's missing. And I think that's a good point, because quite often we don't do that. When we look at the people that are actually taking care of people, the caretakers, who's taking care of them? Most of these folks are immigrants, right? They come with their own philosophy, their own culture.
Right.
How do we bring them to the table to get their perspective? So as we formulate things, we don't leave them out of the equation, because when they're left out, they don't respond to what we're trying to give, because we're doing it from a Western perspective. If you have someone from Ghana or West Africa, which is the majority of people that you find in the congregate care setting, but we don't take the time to really engage them. And a good example, one of my colleagues had mentioned that he thought he was doing something good during this pandemic by sending boxes of pizza to a residential program. But then the people there were from West Africa. They don't like pizza. So, so the intention was good.
He was trying to say, good job to the staff. He was trying to say, hey, great job. Here you go. Here's
Here's 10 boxes of pizza, but pizza is not what we eat, know. Yeah. So I took that story to say we don't quite often ask the question, how do we meet people from where they are? And the only way to do that is get them around the table and include them and listen to them and get a perspective as you formulate. So we need to move to that direction also, because we are becoming very international in our industry as well, that we cannot just assume that what works for me is going to work for my staff.
Yes. I think I had something on that, and I'm distracted a little because we're getting some great chat here, but there was something I wanted to add to your point. How much of the persons that are working there, yes, maybe they get an orientation, but how much are they clued in? Is there a dialogue of the differences from their historical perception of disability, their historical cultural experience, forget even disability, right? Just culturally how we're different, right? And I lived in two cultures a lot of my life, youthful life more so, where I lived in Little Armenia and I lived in the USA. And extended family gatherings, right? And even though everyone was working and assimilating, there were these, and I'm sure that's true, right? With every group that comes. I'm an immigrant myself. So I think on the, another example is the people are here, but we just don't take advantage of how to leverage them. And I think that even relates to Dawn's point about feeling like complex families with medically complex kids weren't at the table. Here, DPH has a program for the medically complex, right? And DPH is actually leading the virus issue, but I'm assuming there wasn't proper consideration given around that population and including unpaid caregivers, right? And hold it, what are we doing about this group of individuals and families? Can we get to the unpaid caregivers as well, at least in these cases, if it's too overwhelming, to figure it out for families as a whole? And it's true also in terms of the workforce. We have these workers in the different settings. Sometimes during COVID, it's tough, right? Everyone's straight out. But before COVID, why didn't we say, hey, can we get a couple people from each affiliate to talk about what there's, could we do and I know, again, agencies want to solve their own problems and not confuse across the line because there's different salaries, different benefits, God forbid, right? It starts new problems. Right. And I've experienced that with my colleagues, I'm not talking about, by the way, my art colleagues, I'm talking about across the board, but I think that's another area where the people are there. How do we develop those kinds of mechanisms that doesn't cost a lot of money? And maybe we avoid that comparison because we're having a handful of people come and help us understand what the barriers they experience. What are the most difficult things that end up being about their job? So it's about our constituents. It's about our workforce that's so vital that we don't have enough of, by the way, right?
Yes.
So, and then, so a couple other things and then I want to give a chance for anything else you guys want to say before we wrap this up. But I want to say, Kathy mentioned about prior planning prevents poor performance. That's a great point. Lucy said another consideration is level of need versus numbers. Who needs services? Mild disability versus profound issues. And I don't, what I think Lucy's saying with that is not to splinter like Jassy was getting at before, which we worry about, right? But more like there's different needs based on where people are at, both intellectually and physically, in terms of what they're able to do. That's true. But that's why person-centered, what you were getting at before, hopefully resolves those needs, resolves that any kind of gulf. People are treated as individuals. And then Linda mentioned DDS also has a program for the medically complex. Yes, good point, Linda. There's the groups across the state, and Kathy was actually one of the coordinators of one of those groups in the past. And we actually brought the groups together in the 90s. And believe it or not, to talk about medically complex and it's what can be done. Because again, there was problems then in terms of having enough supports. And then Dawn brings up one barrier, and the different divisions don't understand what each department serves. And DDS said it should cover all the nursing needs. Unless you're covered by DDS, you can have profound physical needs. There's a gap for those people left behind. So. And that's a great point. There is, there's the eligibility issue done at DDS that people have to have. So everyone with medically complex isn't automatically become a DDS participant. So that's a whole other area, the cross-disability movement and historically what's happened there, not only in Massachusetts, but across the country. There's these divisions. So I'm trying to think, wow, this has really been a pretty vibrant dialogue. Anything you'd like to say, Jassy first and Gabe, or vice versa? Who wants to go first? It's almost 12:45.
I think just very quickly, Leo, it really comes back to looking at our humanity and how we care about people, how we remove barriers. Because when you even look at the state, there's still struggle between agencies. Agencies don't talk to each other. Yep. They're all working independently. So I think when we talk about that round table, and I know this is heavy lifting, but how do we bring everyone together? Agencies that are serving disabilities folks, whether it's Mass Health or DDS, how do we have a common thread that bring us together? Because we waste so much energy and so much resources by all of the sectionalization of agencies and so forth. That's my one thing I want to say is humanity being the center of everything we do. the people we serve, they have to be at the center. The people that the caregiver have to be at the center, or else we're not going to experience true success as we move forward.
Gotcha. And Jassy?
Well, I definitely want to echo what Gabe just said. I mean, that the humanity is crucial. We should never forget the human element, regardless. I mean, a system doesn't work or not work. It's based on the people that populate it. But another thing, I want to go back to what I was saying about King and his optimism and his ability to sort of not give up hope, because it seems that optimism is very interesting. I mean, if you keep an open mind and if you keep an open heart and if you realize there is always a way, there's always a solution, you could actually usually come up with one, as opposed to if your reaction is to say, well, this is hopeless. So you wind up either just doing things the way they've always been done or doing nothing. But if you think, let me just be open to new experiences and new perspectives, actually you can come up with better solutions. You can open your mind. And so it's important to stay optimistic and to stay open-minded.
Excellent. And with that in mind, what I'm going to do is read, and again, in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. I always forget the junior, but in honor of him and hope and keeping hope alive, that Barack Obama did such a great job of presenting the American people. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. So that was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, Gyasi. Great discussion. Thank you, everybody that was chatting. You really made it a real alive session. God bless you all and have a great day. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Leo.
Take care.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye.